Good morning, everybody. We have an amazing day planned. I've been so excited about this conversation that we have today. With us is Sohrab from the New York Post, and we just had an amazing conversation on the Charlie Kirk Show, and Josh Hammer from Newsweek, and we wanted to have this discussion around different religious views all agreeing that we need to save Western civilization. And I want to kind of start this conversation first by asking, what is Western civilization? So we're going to talk about this from an evangelical Protestant standpoint, from a Jewish standpoint, and then a Catholic standpoint, which I think is going to be really fun and exciting. So Josh, welcome, and walk us through, first of all, what is Western civilization?
All right, yeah, so thank you, Charlie. Thanks to Turning Point for having me. I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank Charlie for being a Newsweek columnist, so, thank you for that. And, yeah, great to be here. Sohrab and I got dinner last night. We were joking about how we can possibly talk about how to save the West in 30 minutes, so let's, kind of dive right in and get right to the point here. So, Leo Strauss famously defines Western civilization as kind of the ever-existing tension between Jerusalem and Athens, between the Bible and between kind of Greco-Roman reason, if you will. I think that's a good place to start. I'm a research fellow at the Edmund Burke Foundation, which is Yoram Hazony's think tank. It's a home for kind of national conservatism. And we think of the nation state as being directly derived from the Hebrew Bible, actually, the tribes of Israel themselves kind of being the original, the OG nation state, if you will. So I think just recovering a sense of biblical identity and the importance of the nation state in contrast to globalism, in contrast to all sorts of kind of utopian global ideals is a good place to start. So it starts with the Bible, truth, Jerusalem, Athens, and then obviously Rome as well, which is, more my good friend's territory, of course.
There's a lot there, and so Sohrab, you have an interesting perspective on this. So can you tell us what makes the West different? Why is this worth preserving? And dare we say, is the West better than other civilization projects currently or previously?
So I would define the West, not too dissimilar from what Josh shared, as the combination of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Judeo-Christian religion. And what's special about that combination is this view that man and woman are at home in the world, that there is that using reason we can understand the world, and because we are part of a whole that is a legible whole that can be discovered using reason, we can also understand what it means to be happy as a human being. And then the Christian dimension comes in, the dimension of revelation, and that points out that although we have some natural ends that are good for us, we flourish in families, we flourish in political communities, there's the health of a body that you can discover and learn about, but that there's also a supernatural good that ultimately points us to a transcendent horizon beyond this world. So we're of this world, we are in this world but not of it, but nevertheless we love it because it's God's creation. I think that, and we can ultimately then help people reach that flourishing using law, which is where the Roman aspect comes in. So that tension between those three, that synthesis between those three is the West, and it's made for a truly glorious, beautiful civilization.
So I hear from both of you that it's this balance between reason and revelation. So Sohrab, I want to ask you, do you think that there's been an overemphasis on reason, almost overemphasizing the Enlightenment and almost putting away the tradition of what is a transcendent order? Who are we and how are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to strike that balance? Because you're saying that we shouldn't forsake reason. It sounds like an argument that Thomas Aquinas would make about how reason being a gift from God. At the same point, you say if we govern solely by reason, then all of a sudden we start to have a massive issue on our hands. Can you help us navigate that?
Well, I would reformulate the question. I would say that the Enlightenment modern view is an unfortunate narrowing of reason compared to what the pre-moderns, the ancients, and the medievals thought reason could accomplish. The modern view is generally that reason is only that which can be known with our senses, what we can measure with our scientific instruments, And that's reason. And everything else becomes revelation or opinion or superstition. Whereas the tradition that stretches from Aristotle to St. Thomas Aquinas says, no, actually, we can also know by reason. We can know of God's existence. We can know that there is an objective human good, that human beings flourish in one way and not in other ways, and we can make these judgments about them. So what we live in is not only the fact that God has been banished, unfortunately, from the modern West, but we've actually gotten a too narrow account of what reason can do.
I think that's really well said. So Josh, Rob mentioned something, and so did you. There is this idea of objective truth. It's something that we don't like to talk about very much in the last 20 years. In fact, we play into this idea of my truth. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that on your college campus or your high school campus. How many of you have heard that recently? It's my truth. Is there such a thing as my truth? And what happens when we decide to organize society around everyone's independent view of how they think society should be organized?
So, I mean, the short answer is that no, of course not. There's no such thing as quote unquote my truth. So, I would be remiss if, as the Jew on a panel with one evangelical, a Catholic, and a Jew, if I didn't talk about Judaism here a little bit. I think it's important. So today is actually Tisha B'Av on the Jewish calendar, which is actually the saddest day on the entire Jewish calendar. It's a fasting day. You won't see me eating today or anything. Both the first and second temples were destroyed on this day. Lots of other tragedies happened to the Jewish people on this day. The edict of expulsion from the kicking the Jews out of England happened on this day in the year 1290. The Nazis began the rounding up of the Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka in 1942 on this day. So I was actually in the Warsaw Ghetto in Treblinka less than 2 months ago. I was over there in Poland. And it's kind of a very roundabout way of answering your question, Charlie. But it was my first time seeing the ghetto, seeing the death camps for myself. And when you see that level of human depravity, when you see that level of evil, but you also learn the good stories. You learn about the heroes, the people on the outside of the walls of the ghetto who helped the Jews, so the heroes in the camps themselves. You see that there's also such good, that human beings are capable of such good. And it was very difficult for me to kind of walk away from that with such a kind of moral relativism of like my truth, your truth, his truth, her truth. There is such thing as good. There is such thing as bad. And from my perspective, it obviously starts in the Bible. And I think the three of us probably have slightly different definitions, I'm sure, of like what the Bible is and what that contains and what to make of that. But that is where truth begins, obviously, is in the Bible.
And so, Josh, let me just follow up. So in the Jewish belief of the Old Testament, it's this belief in the law that was given by God. And so if you were to even say that on a college campus, you will be ridiculed and mocked that the divine would give you a way to live your life. Using the best reason-based argument you can you help equip the audience here of how do they tell their friends on a secular type college campus, no, there actually is a law, and if you follow it, it will actually make you more free. Can you help us walk through that?
Yeah, no, this is a fabulous question. I think Saurabh and I both have a lot of thoughts on this exact topic, actually. So there is this paradox. There is this mentality that has really kind of creeped in the United States and a lot of Western civilization for the past half century, really more than that, the past century and a half at least. A lot of it is intellectually downstream of the Enlightenment, of particularly bad strands of Enlightenment thought, I would add. The Enlightenment's obviously complicated. The Scottish Enlightenment is a heck of a lot better, for example, than other strands. But let's simplify and say that a lot of this kind of this intuition that we are free when we have maximum consumer choice, that we are free when we can use whatever social media platform we want to realize self-realization, self-potential. I'm a lawyer by training, and one of the more infamous Supreme Court cases of the past 30, 40 years, the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case, which effectively reaffirmed Roe versus Wade in 1992, Anthony Kennedy has this utterly ridiculous passage. Lawyers call it the mystery passage, where he talks about how like the great achievement in human life, it's the eternal mystery, it's everyone's duty to define his or her own existence. Yes. That's kind of this mentality to its climax, right? All of this is nonsense, and it explains a lot as to why Western civilization has just gone totally off the rails. Saurabh has been adamant about this, probably more eloquent about it than basically anyone in this space, so I don't want to take up too much of his time. But there is a different conception of freedom There's a different conception of freedom that is not just libertarian, live and let live. There's a different conception of freedom, that true liberty can only be attained and fulfilled through living a virtuous lifestyle with certain constrictions and parameters and barriers in place. When the founders, we speak of the founders in broad terms, the founders disagreed about this among themselves. Perhaps Jefferson, when he spoke of self-evident truths, he had this more enlightenment, motivated, kind of strong form of Lockeanism. But there were other founders too, Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, who definitely adhered to this more traditional view of freedom. And we see current politicians today, a lot of what Senator Josh Hawley is doing, for instance, is really trying to, I think, kind of recover this definition of freedom. So that is what Sohrab and I and a lot of our work are trying to do for sure.
So Sohrab, I first became aware of you during a debate where I thought I knew where I stood on the issue. Because I was trained in the conservative movement in 2012, 13, and 14 to believe that freedom meant that a person should be able to do whatever they saw fit as long as it doesn't harm another person. And this really interesting debate kind of became front center in the conservative movement, which kind of started on the outer, more wonky areas, and it kind of moved into kind of the mainstream, which was that should we as conservatives use political power to prevent drag queen story hour from happening at public libraries? And I thought I knew. I was like, oh yeah, freedom. I don't like it, but who am I? And then I heard a very articulate argument for Sohrab, and I won't dare steal the argument from you, but you won me over. And I think with millions of others, where all of a sudden, if we are not protecting and conserving tradition, if we're not even protecting our children, then what good are we actually doing? Just walk us through that argument a little bit, and then the impact that it had.
Yeah, so the argument was, and it's not just Drag Queen Story Hour, which at the time I was a recent father, and it did outrage me, the fact that, drag queens, I live in Manhattan. I actually happen to live literally above a drag bar, and Josh has seen it because it's my place. That's one thing because it's known as, okay, that's where you go. You have your, if you're about to get married, you have your bridal party at the drag, fine. But to say that this needs to be brought forth in front of children, and to say, well, this frankly, transvestic fetishism should be normalized for kids, outraged me as a father. Maybe it's because I'm from the Middle East, but I think a lot of Americans who aren't from the Middle East have the same intuition that there's something gone really wrong civilizationally when that happens, and someone dressed in latex boots up to here is reading books to toddlers is bizarre. And so I argued that some of this has to do with precisely what Josh said, is this account that freedom just means having maximal choice and having as much autonomy as you want. And what that paradoxically does, because it gets rid of various traditional limits, it makes us less free. We see this in gender ideology so much more, right? Gender ideology initially began as this claim about, look, I subjectively believe that I'm a woman, but I've been born into the body of the man. Why don't you recognize it and let me do what I want? It doesn't stop there, because my demand for full autonomy begins to become, you have to recognize me as such. Therefore, you have to alter your language. Therefore, we have to create a new pronoun system. Therefore, you may be banned from social media if you use the wrong pronoun, and so on and so forth. So I know she's speaking here when Tomi Lahren said, well, why are people picking on Caitlyn Jenner, of course, or the person formerly known as Bruce Jenner, of course we have to object to any kind of bullying or viciousness to anyone because everyone is born in the image of God. But why is it important? It's important because reality itself is at stake. Those traditional constraints preserved our ability to have access to reality and not to be forced to say something that is not true, such as the idea that a man can ultimately become a woman. No, gender differences are fundamental. You don't need to go to Genesis to know this. It's in genetics.
And so, can I follow up on this? And I totally agree. And we're an educational organization, not commenting on politics. I said this on television, that a man who thinks that he's a woman has no place running in the Republican Party in any position whatsoever. And so I want you to kind of help our audience here, though, because if they said what you and I just said, you run like the oldest newspaper in the country, I run Turning Point. In some ways, I'm not going to have to get some sort of crazy activist coming up to me in some, North African lesbian poetry class at their school, right? So how are they supposed to defend their peers who will call them transphobic, who will call them hateful and bigoted, that traditional gender roles, not just, let's forget traditional gender roles. How about like just a man is a man and a woman is a woman? Help equip our audience to be able to be prepared for that.
Yeah, I mean, the language to use is the language of equal in dignity, but also different. Men and women have equal dignity, but they are different. And when you attempt to cross that boundary, it ends up in far worse coercion than what we had before. Again, it's the coercion that you face on campus. But I will say this, you and I and Josh can withstand cancel pressure, right? When I work at the New York Post, when the Hunter Biden story, which we did, I was not involved because I helped run the opinion pages. When we did that, as you remember, Facebook banned reduced circulation on our story. Twitter banned our account. You couldn't even use direct private messages to share our story, which remains to this day to be true. Hunter Biden has not said, those were not emails, that was not my laptop. He could have done that 24 hours, 2 hours after the story dropped. They didn't. It was a true story that was censored. But look, we can fight back. I can go on Fox, my colleagues can go on Fox, we can make our case. And ultimately, we prevailed as much as you can. At least we got our account back, and now you can share that story. But the ordinary person can't, which is why those of you who are concerned about tradition, as much as you have to show personal courage on campus or in your workplaces, we also have to seek political solutions. Because you're individually, we are too alone. We have to, the pressure of big tech is a matter of fundamental danger to what matters, political speech, right? Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in 1996 was enacted in order to keep prurient content out of these bulletin boards like Facebook, like Twitter, which would come a few years later, but not to suppress political speech. Perversely now, they use Section 230 to repress conservative political speech, but all sorts of prurient content can be found on these platforms. And that, when you have especially the collusion of government, when you have the Biden administration telling these firms that you have to censor X, Y, and Z, you're dealing with something else. It's this blob of corporate government power and political action of the time that would have been recognizable to an Andrew Jackson is what we need.
So Josh, I want to kind of get into this because we have been told as conservatives, the only way to save the West is through cultural transformation and being able to make better arguments. I agree with all of that. And as an evangelical, I think that we need to realize we're in a spiritual battle, not just in a material battle. And I think that, in the specific, religious view that I have, that just, talking about things that we can see is a mistake. However, so often conservatives say, well, I agree that drag queen story hour is wrong. I agree that, I don't want to see men go into a restroom that's a woman's restroom, but who am I to legislate morality? Who am I to use political power? Josh, is it time to start using political power?
The time for that has long since passed, I think, is the short answer. Look, anyone who is answering no to that question does not understand what time it is in America. If you are looking at what is happening out there, we are obviously over 100 years into the Woodrow Wilson kind of progressive transformation, but this transformation happened quite a bit before then. But you can go back again to the writings of the American founders, a very kind of intellectually and politically diverse group, but they spoke all the time about the duty, the obligation of legislators, of lawmakers to pursue a politics oriented towards human flourishing, justice, and the common good of the whole. The preamble of the United States Constitution enumerates 7 substantive ends for governance. I don't have them all memorized verbatim, but a more perfect union, promote the general welfare, domestic tranquility, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, which, by the way, that latter phrase is often, from my perspective, misinterpreted. a lot of people, this became kind of like a running joke, like, hashtag blessings of liberty in this drag queen story hour context. It's kind of like a Twitter meme at this point, but that's totally, totally wrong. If you actually look at what the phrase secure the blessings of liberty is saying, it's the blessings that they're trying to secure. The liberty is an instrumental means to achieve those substantive blessings, which of course are downstream of biblical principles. But more generally speaking here, look, the late Andrew Breitbart, may his memory be a blessing, famously said over and over and over again that politics is downstream of culture. I guess my reaction to that is always, it's a two-way arrow. The two very clearly do relate to one another. I think legislators, I think political statesmen, even judicial statesmen, frankly, our best judges, Chief Justice John Marshall in the early 19th century, the greatest even justices have understood this, that there is a powerful role for the state to also use the levers, whether it's the political levers or the judicial opinion levers, to influence culture as well. And look, we have to know what time it is in America. I realize I've said that already, but you guys are the future. I mean, you have to look out there and see what the left has done. And I guess here's kind of the other thing I'll say about this. Look, Sorab's already talked about this a little bit. Ronald Reagan famously said that the most terrifying words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." That probably was true at the time he said that. I don't think that's true anymore. I think the most terrifying words in the English language in the year 2021 are, "I'm from the ruling class and I'm here to subjugate you." That is what we see with this new Biden administration, countering domestic extremism document. That is what we see with this grotesque partnering with the federal government and big tech, most recently this Facebook, COVID misinformation stuff. We have to get in there. It is way past time for us to get comfortable using the levers of power to get in there and try to steer this ship back in a direction that is healthy, sustainable, again, towards those overarching substantive ends, justice, human flourishing, and the common good before it's too late.
Just very quickly, to Republican legislators that say, legislators but also intellectuals of a kind of establishment, older generation who say, well, my purpose in being in government is just to not use government power. Then why are you in government? I'm sorry, but in any civilization across all of human history, people go into government to use power. It's only this bizarre class of the GOP establishment, I think, which relatively recently has convinced itself its role is to not use power. Of course, and anyone who labors still under the idea that, the public square can be neutral. So-and-so can believe that there are 157 genders. I think there is only 2 sexes, but we can go. It doesn't work that way. And that's an obvious example. There are many others of this kind where we see that one way or another, some orthodoxy or other will be enshrined in the public square. So it might as well be a true orthodoxy, one that says that God is logos itself, reason itself, one that says that man and woman are made in the image of God and therefore they have an inherent dignity. That's the orthodoxy that the West has, broadly speaking, enshrined and should be enshrined again.
Well, and the great irony of it is that each side did the opposite of what the other side was afraid of. And so, for example, it's now the left that is mandating vaccines and trying to control your body, which is what we're always accused of when it comes to the life argument. And we're the ones that are totally indifferent when you want to do something that is probably, not good for society, which is always what we accuse the other side of doing, of kind of just being indifferent. It's all the kind of accusations have now been kind of absorbed as kind of behavioral, traits in each side, which has been a really bizarre thing to see. So, Rob, I want to ask you this as a follow-up, though. Someone like David French would say, who you know very well from your debates, you're nothing more than a central planner. You want to use political power because you don't trust people to have their own ability to self-govern. There's 2 statist movements, and one calls themselves conservatives, one calls themselves liberals. Is that true? Are we just central planners now? Is the era of big government here?
I'm going to appeal to authority. Because someone like David French or other of my and Josh's interlocutors or our critics in the conservative movements make this point. They say that what we want to do is exhort people to virtue and just evangelize the culture, and that will do its job. And I totally believe in evangelizing the culture. Of course, it's the Great Commission. In the Bible, our Lord says, go baptize nations in my name. That's fine. But the ancients never thought that mere evangelization or mere exhortation was enough. It had to have the force of law because most people, because of their fallen nature, need the guidance of law. The law is a teacher. St. Thomas says, exhortations to virtue are good, but they're not enough. You also need some coercive dimension. And if you say, well, coercion is bad, well, guess what? You coerced one way or another. If you're afraid of government coercion, as Josh said, how much more should we be afraid of the coercion of a few Silicon Valley dweebs in Birkenstocks who wield enormous power to unperson you, disappear you from the internet, and therefore so much of your identity is erased, and you don't have a Supreme Court to go to, you don't have a legislator to go to, it's a private company. So coercion is inevitable. Again, the only question is, what are you coercing for? What means are you using? Are you using them for reasonable ends or unreasonable ends? But the idea that you can have a society without coercion is fantasy.
So Josh, what does this look like? So you say it's time to use political power. It's time for us to use the institutions and the instruments that were given to us. And by the way, I want to be very clear. When a conservative has political power, they did not stage a coup to get it. It was given to them by the consent of the governed. But what does that look like? Because the fear, just so we're all clear, is some conservatives, and I hear you with this fear, their alarm bells start to go off. It's a 5-alarm fire. They're like Road to Serfdom, F.A. Hayek, tanks in the streets, surveillance state, 1984, we can't do that, we might as well do nothing. What do we do?
Right. So, I mean, part of this depends on in which sphere of government we're talking about. So, on the state level, a lot of the action nowadays is obviously at the state level. Look, there's a debate right now on the right as to whether we should actually ban the indoctrination of critical race theory, which is effectively anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish racism, as far as I see. Whether we should actually use the powers of the state to ban this outright or to just let it be. The predictable actors have all taken their kind of usual battle lines in this debate. The short answer is, of course, we should ban critical race theory. Properly. This is, hold aside the fact that it's already illegal under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, but of course we should feel comfortable at a state level banning the racial indoctrination of our children to hate their heritage, to hate their race and all of that. At a local kind of municipal governance level, of course we should get on board with banning drag queen story hours. And then at the federal level, we talked about the tech issue. The big tech issue, one of the reasons that I find it so interesting is really it's kind of the tip of the spear for this kind of broader discussion here. It really is kind of big tech is the ruling class's quote-unquote private sector enforcement arm. That's exactly what happened to Saurabh at the New York Post with this Hunter Biden story. I called it their Pearl Harbor attack at the time when Facebook and Twitter it seemed to me to kind of gang up and suppress this Hunter Biden story. Little did I know that literally, 2.5 months later in January, after January 6th, what happened to Parler? It was naked collusion. It was literally naked collusion from Apple, Amazon, and Google to do that. So what do we do about that? Well, it's kind of an all-of-the-above strategy. We talked about Section 230 reform. Any conservative, who calls himself conservative, who does not see the imperative of trying to get rid of big tech's gratuitous Section 230 immunity, again, does not see what time it is. And there are other things, too. We need to get more comfortable with antitrust enforcement, for example. There's a very long Republican Party tradition of antitrust, by the way. It was literally a Republican policy when it was founded. John Sherman, who gave his name to the Sherman Antitrust Act, was the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, the famous general for the Union in the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was a Republican, the great trust buster. And then, of course, there's a common carrier regulation as well, which Justice Clarence Thomas had a fabulous recent Supreme Court writing on. These are all things that I'm thinking about, that I'm writing about, but big tech is really the tip of the spear at a federal level for kind of putting this into action, I think.
So Rob, a lot of these students here are going to go back to campus for the first time in a long time, and they're going to come back to a campus environment. For some of them, it will be even more hostile and even, just quite honestly, unrecognizable. I think that, just to put yourself in their shoes, many of these students kind of had a half-campus experience this last semester with very little activism on campus for obvious, virus protocol reasons. Some students were online. But this is the first semester where it's going to be college again for the first time in almost a year and a half. And since then, we saw the BLM Incorporated kind of, I could call it a revolution almost in the last year, not for the better. And so a lot of the students here are going to be asked the question in their class and from their friends, why is this civilization worth saving? It's colonialist, misogynistic, hateful, homophobic. Don't you realize this is nothing more than an oppressor and oppressed scheme? Give them a little bit here of how they can deal with that, because they are constantly bombarded with this line of propaganda.
Well, I mean, you have to defend the West. But what I would do is I would defend the West rightly understood. And again, I will repeat this: Greek philosophy, Judeo-Christian religion, and Roman law, that combination. And it's a source of an incredibly humane civilization. It's a source, as I said, of a civilization that says that God so loved the world that he sent his only son. And that son, that person is truth, is reason itself. Now, if you do that, then you can be nuanced. You know, they bring up some colonial crime, and you say, yeah, that was bad. It fell short of what the civilization's true meaning was, but also then put it into perspective next to civilizations that didn't have that, and so the barbarism, you know, of the Roman Empire before its conversion. In some ways, as wonderful of a civilization it was, it also had its barbarous aspects, or you know, the kind of civilizations of the Americas before the arrival. I mean, there's brutality there, but you can judge it all next to the absolute standard of truth, rather than trying to apologize for everything. You don't have to apologize. There's some things that were bad.
So Josh, in closing here, there's this narrative that continues, which is that freedom is being able to do whatever you wish. We touched on this earlier. If you go to the Harvard Law School, in one of their stairway corridors, they have this big saying that says, "The law is the wise restraints that keep men free." So I want everyone to think about this, that it's the restraints that you put on yourself that keep you free. It's not doing what you want to do that keeps you free. How do we take back the word of freedom? Because I think we have allowed these beautiful words of liberty and freedom, which are the Greek words eleutheria and isonomia, we've allowed it to be corrupted into almost indulgence. Some would call it licentiousness. How do we take that back? And then it's hard for an 18 and 19-year-old because there's kind of this "I'm bulletproof and I walk on water" mentality. How do we win that argument?
Yeah, and it's kind of the million-dollar question, obviously. First of all, I'm shocked that Harvard Law School...
It'll be removed soon.
Yeah,
I keep mentioning it. It's just
exactly.
Harvard will take that down in a blazing glory soon.
Yeah, no, I'm shocked it's not already canceled, to be honest with you. But, I mean, that was effectively, that quote right there, that was the consensus. I mean, that was the way that human beings, whether in Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, at English common law, you know, the United States, obviously, we inherited the English common law. It's still kind of our state-level law for property, torts, all this stuff. The English common law was emphatically based on the quotation that Charlie just said there, that without restraints, without kind of an inherent orientation towards societal, national interest, common good-oriented virtue, that the law itself was not true law, that it was not substantive law. So how do we actually kind of go ahead and take that back? Well, you know, I don't have all the answers, but I can just give a couple of ideas here. I mean, like I said, you know, there are, I think, some legislators, there are some politicians who I think get this. The fact that in kind of a hands-off approach to big tech is increasingly anathema in the Republican Party is great. It's a great place to start, I think. But it ultimately, and so I've kind of hinted at this earlier, it has to go beyond that. The threat of woke capital, the threat of corporate power in general in America, is very real. And I think there was a time, you know, where it probably made sense for the American right, for the GOP establishment, for the Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, to kind of get in bed and cozy up one another because, you know, the corporations would promise more choice, more consumer choice, you know, lower prices, right? All this kind of like neoliberal fantasies that we were sold. And what was the result of that? What was the result of kind of this maximal bipartisan neoliberalism? An unprecedented opioid crisis, ripping apart the industrial heartland, jobs shipped like you've never seen to China, to say nothing, of course, of Mexico and countries in our own hemisphere. So we have to kind of just talk about and just get there in the public discourse through conversations just like this. At the federal government level, senators like Josh Hawley are kind of already saying things along these lines. That freedom is only true freedom insofar as we are looking out for the common good of the whole, insofar as we are expressly legislating and enacting policies oriented towards that. So Tom Cotton's another example, and I'll just end on this note. He has a recent kind of policy proposal. I don't remember the exact details, but he basically would just would tax Harvard, Princeton, Yale, et cetera, their endowments, and then directly take that money to provide better access to kind of technical training, community college. These are exactly the sort of policies that we should be looking at. Whether they call us statists, authoritarians, leftist, central planners, who cares? That's what we have to do. That is a time in America, and we can only just encourage it with conversations like this.
So here's how I want to close. I know that we're going a little over time. First, if you want to hear this conversation and the extended backstage conversation, if you guys can hear it on the Charlie Kirk Show podcast. Thank you for subscribing to it. And if you guys aren't yet subscribed, if everyone in this room subscribed, we would beat Rachel Maddow in the New York Times in the podcast charts. So that would mean, if you take out your phone and subscribe, it would mean a lot. And we're going to have some backstage conversations that we're looking forward to diving deeper. Here's how I want to end this conversation. So Rob, talk about what your faith has meant for you. Talk about your faith journey. I know we have like 30 to 45 seconds. And just because some people out here might be drifting away from their faith. They might have been raised Catholic. They might have went to a Catholic school and they're like, I don't want to get involved in that. Talk about your own personal story.
Sure. I mean, I converted in December 2016. And I mean, thank you. The church needs the claps, not me. But what it's meant to me is, frankly, I mean, I was living my 20s. I was working as a journalist in New York and London, but had this sense that there's more to life, and that sense found its fulfillment ultimately at the altar. And since this is a panel about tradition, the best definition I've encountered, it's the shortest, is tradition is ordered continuity. That is, you have this sense that there are steps leading behind you, and therefore steps leading in front of you. And to live within the bounds of tradition, you actually get a lot of confidence, right? That I know what I am. I'm a man, and I will find my true fulfillment in family life, in having children, and that allows me to actually be free to leap forward. And I can kind of eliminate a lot of distractions that I actually don't need once you do that, rather than being like looking inside yourself, who am I? What do I really believe? There are certain truths, really fundamental truths, that have been handed down. That's tradition. Traditio is to hand down. And so you don't have to explore your insides for wisdom. You probably won't find it there. When you have this, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. That's the beauty of all tradition.
And speaking of things that are traditional, basically the world's first religion, tell us about your faith and what it's meant for you, Josh.
Sure. So, I mentioned Edmund Burke in passing earlier. Edmund Burke was not Jewish, to be clear, but he did famously speak of this notion of a partnership among the generations, dead, living, and unborn. That is how I think about politics, and that's how I think about religion in general. I take an immense amount of pride and joy, frankly, in the fact that as a Jew, I can directly trace my lineage to Revelation at Sinai. It's an incredibly powerful thing for me. Look, I grew up personally in a fairly kind of secular home. I grew up in a Jewish home that would really only go for kind of the high holidays, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. As I've gotten older, now when I travel for conferences like this, when I go speaking and stuff, I always travel with my siddur, with my prayer book, with my tefillin, which is what Jews always every day they wrap themselves with. It's part of the liturgical morning prayer, the Shacharit service. And what I've learned, and it's kind of similar really to what Sorab said, is that you are not prepared, especially in this line of business, Charlie. In this line of business, you are not prepared. We are not prepared to go out there and do kind of intellectual fisticuffs, to kind of engage in the public square, to duke it out in the battle of ideas, if you don't have something to point to. You need something in there to guide you, to sustain you, to look at every single day. As I've become more observant over the past few years, as I've come to kind of pray every day, I find that. I only hope that all of you can find that as well.
It's wonderful. I want to keep talking to these two, and you guys can hear that exclusive stuff if you check out the podcast. For me personally, I gave my life to Christ in 5th grade. It's meant more every single year as I've gotten older, and it's been the most amazing thing. And I totally agree, Josh. In this space, if you don't have something anchoring you, and that means a personal relationship with Christ and realizing that I am not enough, that salvation is not going to be earned in checking a bunch of boxes, but instead being obedient and accepting Christ into my life and making him the chairman of the board of all of my decisions and everything that I do. And so I just want to say that this kind of conversation is really unique, and we need more of it. And I don't think we disagreed on basically anything. But for all of you guys out here, the big takeaways are respect tradition, to know that road ahead, ask those coming back. And Lord Falkland famously said that if it's not necessary to change things, it's necessary not to change them. And I think all of you can be articulate and compassionate, yet firm and courageous spokespeople for this beautiful gift that we have been given, which is Western civilization. Quite honestly, the greatest experiment in self-government in human history. And that's really what we're fighting here for at Turning Point USA, to save the West. God bless you guys. Thank you so much.